Hello, welcome back. You're watching Breakfast with Nagamon Chetty and Charlie State.
Good morning to you. It's coming up to 8:30. Now, an investigation by BBC News has found that it would take the NHS 8 years to see all adult patients currently waiting for an ADHD assessment across the UK.
Comes figures suggest nearly 200,000 individuals are awaiting a diagnosis for the condition. Well, three people who know this story so well with us now. Matthew Menzies, who has been diagnosed with ADHD. Morning to you, Matthew. Rachel Fanner, who's waiting for a diagnosis. And Thea Stein from Nuffield Trust is with us as well. Do you know, because people are interested in ADHD and how it affects you, I was just curious about the environment you're in this morning in a TV studio. Rachel, how is this for you? Is it challenging?
It's quite overwhelming because one of my previous therapists said that neurodivergent people take in 5 times as much information as neurotypical people. So while someone else might be just listening to what you were saying, I can hear the hubbub of the studio behind when there were conversations happening between Naga and Thea behind you, and the interview for the video a moment ago, and the bubble on the logos behind you, the water moving, and everyone else's brain just filters that out. Well, neurotypical brains officially filter that out. I don't think typical is quite as typical as, but...
And Matthew, for you, are there similarities there?
Yeah, I mean, I think Rachel put it perfectly. For me, my sensitivities are auditory, so this is actually quite nice and kind of calm, settled environment, whereas put me in a bar or a cafe and ask me to have a conversation, and all I can hear is people's cups moving and spoons on cups and other people's conversations. It's almost impossible to concentrate on the
Do you find you can hear the person
address.
Behind you more than the person in front of you?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And it's so important and interesting hearing you say that, because it comes right to the point here, Rachel. You cannot get a diagnosis at the moment for your condition.
Yeah.
Why is that?
So part of this is the issue of moving house. So having lots of addresses, the NHS can't keep up with where you are, and that slows things down. Every single time there's waits for them to update their systems. But when I moved to Oxfordshire from Hampshire, I had been on the waiting list in Hampshire for about a year, and then I moved to Oxfordshire and I'd said, what happens with my referrals? And they said, we're not actually sure because there isn't a waiting list here. Can you stay on your one in Hampshire? I contacted my previous GP and they said, we don't actually know what the process is for doing this.
So you are caught between a rock and a hard place. You don't know where to go, and you don't have a diagnosis.
Yeah, I don't have a diagnosis. I do have a diagnosis of autism, and there is also the complicating factor that lots of people are officially recognised to have both eventually, but initially are told, oh, you've already got ADHD, you can't have autism, or you've already got autism, you can't have ADHD, when there's a massive overlap in the Venn diagram of both conditions.
Absolutely. Matthew, you have had a diagnosis.
I have, yes. Yeah.
What difference to your life has that made?
I mean, my diagnosis was a complicated process, but once I was eventually on the right medication and kind of having that holistic support of coaching and educating myself alongside that, it's been the difference between staying in employment, between staying in relationships and maintaining friendships. It's life-changing. It's my pre-diagnosis kind of life was just full of real hard mental health struggles, a lot of mental health crises. And post-diagnosis, I've been able to kind of reveal myself, unmask and kind of reveal the layers of that where I was hiding myself previously, and discover that I'm not just a box of broken kind of tools, that within me I've got lots of strengths, and it was just about creating the right environment for myself to unveil them.
You know, Thea, it's interesting, when you hear the word diagnosis, once upon a time, you would think, oh, they've been diagnosed with something, it's terrible. But the relief from getting a diagnosis, it's not a label, it's a step forward, isn't it? As you described, to having holistic care, to being helped to unlock the broken tools, as you said, you know, you were being seen. Yet we're now looking at, what, 8 years? If the system stays the same.
Yeah.
What will change that?
There's a lot of work at the moment from NHS England to look at this and to try and change it. One of the big challenges has been the scale of growth over really a relatively short period of time. So between 2019 and 2023, you've had a 53% rise in people diagnosed ADHD. Now, as your commentators found out, there's actually no official waiting list for ADHD. When we did the work at the Nuffield, we tried to do exactly what Kath Burns tried to do, to find out how many people are on a waiting list. They're not officially collected. So what we did, we looked at prescribing and we looked at prescriptions to see if we could get a sort of a lens to look at this. And what we found was this massive rise in prescribing over time.
And
that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Why such an increase? Just because it's being recognised more, or
yeah,
it's being, or various symptoms, characteristics being put into the ADHD category?
No, not the latter. It very much seems to be awareness. Right. And awareness raising is a good thing. Sometimes people talk about, oh, people are coming forward and they don't really need to come forward, and how ill are they really? But we have a lot of awareness raising. We've a lot of understanding. We've got many more celebrities who've come out in public and talked openly, and people coming on a programme like this and talking openly, and people have more access to information. So they're coming forward as adults and saying, I wonder if this diagnosis could be an explanation for what's going on in my life.
Rachel, it must be so frustrating, and that's an understatement for you, that I mean, you're sitting next to a man who has gone through the process and has described brilliantly, Matthew, the change it's made. It must be so frustrating for you.
So one of my relatives recently put it that it's failed potential, because I had lots of issues at school. I think lots of neurodivergent people do, but I can't say knuckled down because I fell out of school, but I went different ways. I found alternative ways of doing things, but I eventually went to uni. I found a niche in the neurodiversity sector where I was quite happy, but at the same time, I figured this out on the 23rd, but let's say approximately half of the month, I am asleep all afternoon because my brain has just run out of energy to do things with. There's just no oomph left, which I think is one of the things that the medication can make a difference for people on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think medication can give you the structure and the routine to do the things that are good for you and recognise when you're approaching that burnout. And it allows you then to kind of like manage yourself better, because like you've been through coaching yourself, you were saying earlier, but without that medication to be able to maintain that routine and structure, you're on a kind of slippery slope to that energy loss constantly, and burnout can be really, really severe.
Do you know, I'm thinking that, I mean, Rachel, who's so eloquent here in explaining these things, so we all understand more, it's such a waste. I mean, that's the obvious thing that comes up. There's a waste of, a talent and a skill set, and someone who could be so much more productive in society for no good reason.
But also, Rachel's explained it to us. Like, we've been sitting here for 8 minutes or so, right? So we know that there is an issue.
Yeah.
What?
So what you've got at the moment...
Who's waiting to say, yes, Rachel, you're right. These are the issues you have to cope with.
At the moment, diagnosis is done by professional teams, by psychiatrists, psychologists, people who have advanced nurse practitioners who'd be working together to listen to everything that Rachel's saying and saying, yes, this is the diagnosis. The way I put it is the size of the NHS capacity to do that work with those specialists is a bit like a pint glass. And for a period of time, that pint glass was enough for a pint of liquid. What you're now trying to do is put 4 pints of liquid into that pint glass. So the pint glass is working really, really hard, but it isn't big enough. It cannot do the work at the speed. And so the challenge the NHS has got at the moment is, and I do think it's a point in time, because we've got lots of adults who are now seeking a diagnosis that actually would have been better made when they were a child. And so we're going to see Rachel nodding, but we've got this group of adults now, and the NHS has to find a way of helping, supporting and diagnosing. My huge hope is that we go through that period of time, and in the future we would be able to put our resources and help into ensuring all children and young people get the resource at the time that they need it, rather than waiting until they're adults. But it is a massive problem at the moment.
Thea, thank you so much. Matt, did you want to say something?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I quickly wanted to say something about being diagnosed as a child. I wasn't diagnosed autistic until I was 16. I'd already fallen out of the school system. Everything had gone wrong because there was no support in place. No one knew anything about what was going on or why. And that was burnout in its own way, because there was no accommodation. Nothing was being done to support me. But I have friends who were diagnosed when they were 4. And going back through my medical records, I had a lisp when I was little, and I had speech therapy for it, and we found on a document when I was about 5 or 6 years old, Asperger's ? From the speech therapist. So someone had noticed that something was not quite right, but something was different, and nothing. It was never followed up.
As you said, it's a system where 4 pints of liquid aren't fitting into the pint glass at the moment.
I really hope, Rachel, you get the diagnosis you need and should be getting. Matthew, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's been really interesting talking to both of you.
As well.
Thank you.